it around the world and came back with stories to tell. Different places to call home. Now I'm never on my own. Salutations to my people hitting foreign nations. Food traveling shit, moving to live. Life in the sky, stories to give. The ones who make it there and can make it back.
Salutations and shit, folks. Welcome back to another episode of your favorite travel podcast, Travel and Shit, where I, your host, D. Carey, have an experiential conversation about the nuanced ways that travel intersects with regular life. And as I especially like to remind you guys, when I have beautiful faces join me, the podcast is also available on the YouTubes. So if you would like to see the faces attached to these very nice voices, please slide your fingers across your phone or your laptop, whatever you're using, and check us out on the tubes. So, diving right into this week's episode, which I am particularly excited about, I have a beautiful guest with me. If my guest, please introduce yourself. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I am Tamara Walker, and I'm an historian, author, and nonprofit founder.
Okay, so the topic of this episode is really a kind of expats. Okay, so we've had plenty of conversations with expats, but never in a historical context. I love history. I am my father's child and will sit and watch the History Channel with him, and also my mother's child, and will actually read about the history as well. One of my favorite books is Warmth of Other Suns, and it is a nonfiction telling, if you will, the story of three Americans, Black Americans, and their migration from the South throughout different areas of the United States. And I was thoroughly intrigued when I learned that Dr. Walker has actually written a book similar to such. So Dr. Walker, if you would please jump into what this book is about. I'm very interested in getting more information.
So my book is called Beyond the Shores, and it's a history of African Americans abroad. And I'll say at the top that I was very much inspired by The Warmth of Other Suns when I wrote this book. I got the title of my book in part in conversation with The Warmth of Other Suns, because that title of her book came from Richard Wright's autobiography, where he talked about his move from the South to Chicago to experience what he said was the warmth of other suns and the chance to bloom. I got the title of my book from an essay that Richard Wright wrote called I Choose Exile. It was never published, but it was an essay he wrote where he explained his decision to leave the United States for Paris. And he poses this rhetorical question in the essay where he says, why have I chosen to live beyond the shores of my native land? And then he goes on to talk about the kinds of freedoms that he was able to experience in Paris that he was never able to experience, even in Chicago after having moved there during the Great Migration. And so I see the book very much being in conversation with Wilkerson's book in terms of spotlighting the people who, during the era of the Great Migration, left the United States rather than going north and west. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They went outside of the country in search of opportunity, in search of themselves, in search of freedom, an experience of their full humanity. And so what I end up doing in the book is charting what I call a century of people on the move. The book opens in the 1920s and closes in the present day, 100 years later. And what I do is blend elements of memoir and history to tell this story. And the narrative structure of the book, the sort of spine of the book, goes decade by decade over the course of the 20th century. And I focus on usually one person or a pair of people and one place or a pair of places that I think best exemplify what was at stake for African Americans when it came to leaving the United States at those particular moments in time. So for the 1920s, for example, I talk about the entertainers who were going to Paris in that era. And when we think of Paris in the 1920s, we tend to think of Josephine Baker. There were also, and for good reason, right? She was someone who really took Paris by storm, who really introduced to this European audience the talents that African Americans had that weren't being recognized in the United States, that they had opportunities to celebrate and put on display in Europe that then led to other opportunities. But I wanted to move away from some of these bold-faced names to talk about other contemporaries of theirs and in some cases lesser known individuals who were part of this story, because this wasn't just a story about famous people. It was a story about ordinary men and women as well. And so the person I end up talking about in the first chapter of the book is a woman named Florence Mills, who was a contemporary of Josephine Baker. She was always kind of running on a parallel track to her, even in Paris, and was explicitly compared to Josephine Baker when she arrived in Paris. Parisian newspapers really tried to kind of pit the two of them against each other, and they could never understand, when it came to Florence Mills, what it was that was keeping her from succeeding in the United States, because she was lighter skinned than Josephine Baker, and they saw her as someone whose counterparts were white actresses. And if those white actresses could have successful careers in the United States, why couldn't Florence Mills? And that gives you a sense of the kind of complicated racial attitudes that the French had during this time period that we often overlook when it comes to talking about African Americans in Europe, because they, by comparison to the US, were much more welcoming than Americans. Okay. But they had their own racial attitudes, and those attitudes came out in the way they talked about Florence Mills in relation to Josephine Baker. There was a tinge, and not even a tinge, an obvious tint of racism in the way they talked about Josephine Baker, even as they were welcoming of her and celebrating her talents. So I wanted to bring in someone who offered us a window onto the complexity of this situation. It wasn't just going from Jim Crow to this welcoming society where they could be whoever they wanted to be. The French also had their own racial issues. African Americans ended up benefiting from their kind of status as Americans in relation to African descent populations, Afro-French populations.
Just like now,
right? So there is, and I end up telling that story over the course of the book, that for as much as this is a story about people fleeing the United States, there was also a privilege that was experienced by the travelers at various points in time and in various parts of the world, including in France. And so I also, in the course of telling the story about Florence Mills, I shine a spotlight on the Black populations that were already existing in France and try to paint a picture of what 1920s Paris was and all of its multidimensionality. And the other reason I talk about Florence Mills is because, unfortunately, and this is a bit of a spoiler, her story ends in tragedy. And that was important to me because often when we talk about African Americans abroad, we think about this story of romance and adventure and opportunity and possibility, and all of that is there. But there's also a tragedy at the heart of that story too, in that there were people who wouldn't, if it were up to them and if they had all the choices available to them, would not have left their country, would not have left their families behind, their communities, the places that they knew, to set out for the various parts of the world they went to. And they didn't just go to Paris. They went to, in the next chapter, for example, I talk about Uzbekistan, this group of cotton cultivators. Yeah, this group of scientists, many of whom were trained at Tuskegee, who went at the invitation of the Soviet Union all the way to Uzbekistan to work in cotton cultivation because they had expertise that the Soviets wanted to benefit from. And they also were in the right place at the right time in terms of the Soviet Union's conflict with the United States. And the Soviet Union understood that the U.S. was pretty hypocritical in terms of trying to present itself on the world stage as this bastion of democracy and this leader of the developed world. Meanwhile, it was treating its own citizens with such contempt. And the Soviets understood that and saw that and wanted to offer themselves up as this alternative, this actual welcoming community where people could be comrades rather than second-class citizens. So the story I tell in that chapter is about that. Yeah. Uzbekistan.
Okay. See, this is the thing that I personally love about history. There are so many like, what the fuck moments. And it's just like, but it's real. You didn't have to make that up, right? Like it absolutely exists. Historically speaking, the way that parallel was between, you were mentioning, it just fluttered away where I just said, yes, like now, historically, were some of the reasons why African Americans left the country back in the 1920s. Is it fair to say that those parallels are still the same? Because I know, like, I have more experience of hearing the rumblings of people that are talking about, oh, if Trump gets elected, I'm out again. Or if this doesn't go this way, I'm leaving. Or the student loan issue is that there's so many current issues. What I guess even historically were maybe the first even documented, or what were the first murmurings? Why did people initially leave the country in the research that you've done?
Yeah. Part of the reason I tell the story the way I do is to show just how diverse those reasons were, because I focus not just on the performers and the dancers and entertainers, but also the scientists. I focus on Peace Corps volunteers and other chapters, aspiring actors and teachers and other chapters. And for every person, there's a different story. But at the core of that story is about the United States and the limitations that the United States imposed on Black people's ambition and opportunity. So in the case of these crop scientists, they were experts in a field that would have served the United States during the Depression in terms of figuring out how to grow crops that could sustain people and feed them during a period of depression and during a period of food insecurity. And yet the United States refused to recognize these scientists and the expertise they had. So the people that I write about had been working as Pullman porters or dishwashers in hotels at the time that the Soviets came along to offer them these opportunities. And it wasn't an easy decision. There, in some cases, for one of the people I write about, he was all in with the communist cause. And he had spent time in Moscow before he was rounding up this crew to go to the Soviet Union. But some of the people that he tried to recruit were hard to recruit because they wanted the United States to provide them with the opportunities they had worked so hard for, and to create space for them to share their knowledge and expertise. And so it wasn't always an easy decision for people to leave. And that's what I wanted to capture in the book, that these were real dilemmas for people. And they were often making decisions that were about being able to work in their chosen profession rather than having to work in manual labor capacities when they had trained to do other things, right? And so that's part of the story. But then for some people, it was also about an opportunity to discover themselves. And I write, for example, about a man who went to Tokyo in the 1980s. His name is Kim Bass. And I knew him before writing the book as the writer of the sitcom Sister Sister. But he came to that job and to that career through a circuitous route that began with having studied in Japan in college. He did some language study. He picked up Japanese, and he went back to Japan.
Japanese. Who picks up Japanese?
It was really interesting. And he just happened to what I liked about his story was that he just happened to kind of be in the right place at the right time in different points of his life, and just willing to kind of see where the road led him. And I love that about his story, that it wasn't this kind of super serious and sort of scary time of fleeing the United States. Instead, it was about kind of being drawn to different things. And he was into martial arts, and he was also just someone who was really interested in experiencing a kind of global citizenship, and found that in Tokyo. But while he was there working as a school teacher, he also got discovered and ended up starring in various film and television productions while he was there. And that's what helped to set him on the path to his career in Hollywood. And so those are all different stories, right? And I think that even today, when we see people leaving the United States, it's for lots of different reasons, right? Some of it is because the U.S. has continuously kind of let Black people down in terms of what kind of country it ends up showing itself to be, rather than the country that it promises to be. But then there are some people who are nomads, right? And who love the experience of adventure and love going where the road takes them, have an interest in languages. My interest in travel stemmed from a lot of different things, but I also took language classes in middle school and high school, and just loved the idea of being able to go somewhere where I could practice Spanish and practice French. And that's also part of the story too, right? People who just have this sense of wanderlust. And what I tried to kind of tap into, especially with the memoir thread of the book, was that sense of wanderlust, where it comes from, why it's so meaningful, and what travel does at different points in life too, right? Not just at the same life stage. And it was interesting for me to be able to talk about people young and old at different kind of in different economic positions, at different life stages, different just points of departure, to really capture the true diversity of the Black experience abroad.
So I have a question for you. Were you surprised by anything that you learned in the course of writing this book?
Yeah, I was surprised by a lot of things. Like part of what I ended up being shocked by in the case of Florence Mills, for example, was that her story ended in tragedy and at such a young age. And that came well after I had started researching and writing the book. And so I had to kind of pivot, and it made me change my approach to the whole book, because
Wow.
I think I had started, and I started writing this book during COVID. So there was a part of me that was trying to escape through the writing of this book and to give myself and my readers this armchair experience of travel. And so I was leaning into the romance of travel and the adventure. But in telling Florence Mills' story, I really came up against this tragedy.
Yeah.
And so it made me take a different view of all of these stories, and to really pay attention to when people had dilemmas and had hesitation when it came to leaving the United States, because it also told me that they had love for the country of their birth. And even as, you know, in the story of the Great Migration that Wilkerson tells, there's also a sense of ambivalence about having to leave the South, right? The place where all their traditions and foodways and family come from. And often people had to leave family members behind, right? So even that story of travel within the United States is one that is infused with some sadness and some tragedy. And people were often forced to leave because of the violence that they were facing in the South. And that was also part of my story too, right? And so I didn't want to just kind of cast leaving the United States as this Band-Aid and as this cure-all, because it was complicated, and all the places that they went to presented different complications. And so the Soviet part of the story was really filled with surprises, including the fact that Langston Hughes managed to visit the people I write about in Uzbekistan and spent Christmas with them one year. And as I started to do more research and writing of the book, Langston Hughes cropped up in a lot of different parts of the story. And he wrote this book called I Wonder as I Wander, and it's his travel memoir. And he talks about his travels around the Soviet Union and Europe and South America, various parts of the world. And one of the things he says at the end of the book is that he's been around the world and seen at least one Negro everywhere. And I just love that aspect of his story, because it's so true. And even now, especially now, where travel has become so accessible and there is much more of a culture, especially on social media, of Black people traveling and exploring far-flung locations, you do see so many Black people in so many different parts of the world. Whereas I remember even when I first started traveling in high school and college, it was still remarkable in some places to run into other Black people, so much so that we would, wave at each other and be so excited to see each other. Whereas now that's just not as common. It's just more of an ordinary occurrence to encounter Black people, even in places like Iceland, for example. So yeah, those are some of the things that really surprised me in the course of writing and researching the book.
One of the things that came up for me in that was, even now, I live in New York and never thought I'd be tired of New York, like ever. Like I always thought I was New York, I'm never leaving. And then you get older and things change, right? And I have one of my best friends, well, most of my friends actually, a good number of my core friends live out of state. And one of them, she and her husband, hey y'all, are always trying to get me to, we loved Houston. Houston was great. We about to be in Charlotte. You could pull up. And it's just in the back of my mind, as much as I am over here, as much as I am not, I would love to leave. It is so easy to fall into the complacency of, oh, but I got a good job. Or, where am I going when I get there? What am I doing where am I working when I get there? Where is my community? Who do I know there? And all of these are coming up for me now in the big Lord's 2024 of things. I can Google anything. I can look anything up. I can route and map the information is there. There is an answer to literally, I won't even say literally, to most any question I can come up with. And throughout history, people have been doing it blind. Like people have done it with so much less information. And I just wanted to bring that up so that people can keep in context, just like even saying the 1920s was 100 years ago, it still feels like I'm in like, oh, it's like I'm working from the year 2000. It's like, oh, that was only like, 75, 80 years ago. It wasn't that. No, it really was that long ago. And through all those years, people have done it with so much less information. So I'm feeling my big feelings of stop telling me to move out of the state. I get it. It's cheaper everywhere else. But what about? That's always been the case. But so for that being my personal experience, what has your personal experience been? Where are you located? Have you always lived there? Have you lived abroad? And what was that experience? Well, if you have lived anywhere else, what was your experience like in making the decision to go from one place to another place?
Yeah. Well, before I get into that, I just wanted to respond to what you were saying, because another thing that really struck me when I was researching this book is how on the ground the Black press was from the beginning of the story I tell well into the present day, just different versions of it. But the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, later Ebony Magazine, these publications were always talking about Black people in other parts of the world. They really pioneered this art of diasporic news coverage. They were talking about Cuba. They were talking about Argentina. They were talking about Black people in all these places, both like Black people who were native to those places, but also the experience of Black visitors to those places. So they were on the trail of all these Black entertainers who went to Paris and London in the 1920s. And in following them there, the editors and the reporters were also doing travel writing, and they were talking about where they were staying and where they were eating and the museums that they were visiting, and in the process inspiring their readers to go to those places as well. And it was no small thing, because they were going to nightclubs where they could actually cross the threshold and be served food, whereas at the Cotton Club here in New York City, they would not have been able to so much as get a glass of water after their performances. So these were places that were welcoming them on stage, but not in the audience. And what those reporters were noticing was that Black people were welcome in these venues, not just as performers, but as patrons. And I just wanted to shout out the Black press for really capturing this story and recording it for posterity, so that when I was researching this book, could just find this trove of stories that I had barely scratched the surface of, right? So there's still so much out there that has yet to be told. But also for inspiring travelers of that generation and onward to look beyond the shores of the United States. So I thought that was really beautiful. And that kind of gets to my story, because I live in New York City now. I teach at Barnard College of Columbia University, but I'm from Colorado. And my family ended up in Colorado because my grandpa was in the Army. And my grandparents are from Alabama, and I end up talking about that in the book, the fact that my grandparents were born in the shadows of the cotton plantation where their ancestors had been enslaved, and my grandpa was part of that great migration generation, but joined the Army and traveled as a result of that. But I grew up really close to my grandparents. They lived in Colorado Springs. I lived in Denver. I was born in Colorado Springs, but I would spend summers at their house. And in the way that kids are, I was always really annoyed by that. I thought I should be somewhere else. And I went to a private school where kids often did go elsewhere. They got to travel a ton, and that was always out of reach for me financially. And so I would be at my grandparents' house, and I would be surrounded by Ebony Magazine and Jet Magazine and be reading these stories about Black people all over the world and going all over the world. And that was really inspiring for me. That gave me a real kind of image to fit with this idea I had of wanting to go to these other parts of the world. And that, together with stories that my grandparents told me about their time living overseas. My grandpa had been stationed after World War II in Austria, in Salzburg, Austria. And he went there with my grandma and my oldest aunt and uncle, and then later another uncle was born there. And I just grew up hearing their stories about their time there and having this kind of sense of, wow, they lived a really interesting life. These people I thought were so boring and stodgy. And then it just opened up all these questions between us. And I just got to learn more about my grandparents. And the more I got to actually travel, finally I took a trip in high school to Mexico with a program that my school offered. It was a 2-week program where we spent 1 week with host families and then another week at an orphanage. And it was an experience that really altered the course of my life. It was the thing that got me really interested in not just Spanish, which I'd been studying in high school, but Latin American culture, which then led me to study abroad in Argentina when I was a junior in college, which then, because it was such a complicated and really painful experience being Black in Argentina.
Wow.
During a time where they hadn't really reckoned with their own history of slavery and their own Afro-Argentine heritage. And they also hadn't really been exposed to Black tourists. There had been some exposure to Black pop culture and famous people. So I, lived in this upscale neighborhood with my host mother in Buenos Aires and would go to the bakery. And there was a girl at the bakery who couldn't process me. So she was like, well, are you an actor? Are you an athlete? That those were the things she could conceive of. She couldn't conceive of me being a college student. That just was outside the realm of possibility for her. And I got stared at a lot. And the presumption people had about me there was that I was Brazilian. And that was a loaded assumption because in Argentina at the time, they assumed that Brazilian women in Argentina were there as sex workers. So by extension, the assumption is that that's what I was. And you can imagine what that meant in terms of how people looked at and talked at me. So all of that got me really interested. Like as I kind of lived through it and processed it, I got really interested, in what history kind of produced that present.
Yeah.
And so then I ended up applying to graduate programs with an interest in race in Latin America, and then ended up taking a slightly different path in terms of the research that I did. I wrote a dissertation on slavery and dress in colonial Peru. So then I did dissertation research in Peru. And my first book was actually about that topic. But through it all, I've been just really interested in lots of things: history, slavery, race, national identity, Latin America, Black mobility. That's the thing that kind of ultimately led me to writing Beyond the Shores. But I would never have become a historian of Latin America had I not had travel experience. And I would never have been able to write Beyond the Shores had I not been this historian of Latin America who was aware of the different ways that race operates in Latin America and in different parts of the world, to be able to talk about Blackness in a global way. So not just to talk about African Americans going to these parts of the world, but to think about the Black populations that were already in those parts of the world and how different their experiences were going to be.
I really cannot wait to read this book. Like, I am just so like, sparks fired, fight off. There's so many, because it's like when you go places, and I specifically heard you when you said the way that people talk at you, not to you, but at you. And so it's like when you go these places and you feel like, I generally will like experience something like in a feeling first before, and then I'll kind of just, all right, what am I feeling? Why do I feel this way? Is this a good or is it a bad thing? And all those things happen fast, but like you go places and you try to order something, or you try to kind of flow in with what's going on, especially like if you're not familiar with the place, right? So I don't know how much research you do before you go someplace. Sadly, I don't really do too much. I kind of just show up and go with the vibes, right? But I am traveling for pleasure. Like, I'm not traveling for anything of, I don't want to say importance, because pleasure can be important. There's no reason why it shouldn't be. Yeah. But nothing academic or nothing business wise, right? So I could see why going in those capacities, you've got more information. I would assume that you'd have more information when you're going into it with a specific reason at hand. But when you're just going for funsies and you just show up, a lot of times you don't realize this neighborhood in particular, that experience, they're not used to you. Or first time, especially when I was a new traveler, I didn't know what I didn't know. I ended up going to Barcelona. However, I was saving money and decided to stay at this really lovely, not a hotel, not a hostel, but a short stay. It felt like an apartment complex. It was gorgeous. It was like an hour outside of Barcelona. And I had no idea that, and this was still Baby Traveler, new. It was all, again, funsies. And in hindsight, that could have been a really bad situation. That could have been a really bad situation just because you don't know where you're staying. You don't know what the local communities of certain areas are really welcoming to, or not even welcoming, but tolerant of.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I will never forget is, and I remember the feeling more than I remember the exact occurrence of what happened, but I was in the middle of like real basic boring town Barcelona. And I'm like, all right, well, I can't, because it took me $100 to basically get from the airport to where I was staying. And I said, well, I don't have that in the budget to do it again because I knew I had a day trip. So I'm trying to enjoy the local area and I'm passing by. I have no idea what's inside, but it's just it's a doorway, doors open. It's too dark to see what's going on inside. And there's like a younger man standing outside and he starts saying something to me as he's walking out the door. And immediately I wanted to respond like New York me. But then I realized, I don't know who the fuck's in there. I don't know what all they got in there. I don't know what he's actually saying to me. He could be being very pleasant, but I don't speak anything. I don't entiendo poquito español. And it was one of those things where you thankfully think before you react. And hearing how, I won't categorize it as terrible for you, but what sounded like a really traumatic, if nothing else, experience.
Yeah.
I think that that's something that even if you have young scholars, parents, consider looking into where our babies are doing their study abroads. I had a friend of mine who did dental school in Spain. I feel like she went prior and had a good time, but then the living there for her, it was completely a different experience, and she hated it. She hated it. What do you suggest for people who have their young children that are going to do a study abroad, whether they be in high school doing it or in college doing it? What resources? Because there's always a good travel. You can always Google. You can go on the YouTubes and ask, solo traveler for this location. But in terms of being an academic or going there for school, I think our tourist locations and then schooling may not always be the same. What resources or suggestions might you have for those people looking to do those things?
Yeah, it's funny because when I first got back from studying abroad in Argentina, I was really angry because I had gone to a lot of orientation sessions for my program and just heard nothing about the racial climate in the country. And I came back really frustrated with my school for not providing me any sense of preparation for what was in store for me. Then I was also really upset with Lonely Planet, because that was, especially in those days, late 90s, it was like the Bible for traveling. And Lonely Planet had sections about traveling as a woman. And increasingly, they started to have sections for traveling as an LGBTQ person. And yet, through it all, it was clear that the default traveler they were talking to was white. So a white woman, a white LGBTQ traveler, but there was no acknowledgement of being Black or being Indian or brown, right? Southeast Asian or anything other than white in these books. So there was no, even for all the research I had done, is my point. I wasn't prepared for what I encountered. But I think if I had known how difficult the experience was going to be, I wouldn't have gone. But then I'd have a completely different life, right, than I have now. Like, I recognized that what I experienced there was really formative for me and defining for me. It set the course of my kind of intellectual journey and my belief system in a lot of ways, because I also think Black people belong everywhere, right? So I tend to bristle sometimes at when I kind of dig into the world of social media and travel. I sometimes get a sense of people being discouraged away from certain places. And I worry about the impact of that, because I think the only changes will come from our continued presence in these parts of the world, especially in places that have really kind of troubling relationships with Blackness. Italy comes up a lot, especially because of how it treats migrant Black populations, right? And so I think it's important to be informed about what's happening. And to answer your question in terms of the kinds of preparation one can do before going on these trips, I think reading local newspapers is a really good way in. And there's so many English language newspapers that give you some boots on the ground perspective into what's happening economically, politically, socially, culturally, like what kind of cool things are happening, like movie wise, theater wise, music wise. And it, I think, provides a sense of what the lived experience of that place is outside of the touristic experience. And that's something, and I can talk more about this in a bit, that we do with my nonprofit, which focuses on making international education opportunities accessible to high school students from low-income backgrounds, is that we provide them with a lot of pre-departure training, which consists in large part of learning about the place they're going and reading English language newspapers, or if they speak the language, reading newspapers or websites and social media posts from people who are living in those places. And then, we often have parents who are really worried about sending their kids away to these places that they'll not see for themselves as parents, right? They can't case the place and get a sense of what it's going to be like for their kid. And that often results in parents not wanting their children to study abroad in certain places, if at all, right? Because it is a leap of faith. And it's only, as I've gotten older, that I appreciate just how scary that is for a parent. I'm not a parent, but because I have this nonprofit where we're, taking other people's children, we're not actually we're not taking them on the trip. So we are responsible for them, right?
Yeah.
And we care about what happens to them. And, I travel a fair amount with my family now, and sometimes we're not on the same flights. So my mom will come meet me somewhere. And I remember one time my mom did this where she came to meet me in Paris and went rogue. She had decided that instead of taking a taxi, she was going to take public transit to the apartment where we were staying, but didn't have data on her cell phone. So she didn't have a way to tell me. And I was so worried. And I remember in that moment recognizing how worried she must have been all the times that she let me go out into the world. And when I went to Argentina, this was not a time of cell phones. This was a time of call centers where I had to track to make a call. And it was not a time of easy access to email. I had to go to the same call center to hop on a computer to send an email. And I was young and intrepid, so it didn't really matter that my mom was worried for me. But now because I worry for her and worry for other people's children and my friends' kids, I have appreciation for that, right? But I also think that those are such important experiences at that age, right? That sense of fearlessness that can be cultivated, and not in an unreasonable, reckless way, but there is something about just being firm in your belief that you belong everywhere and that you have to kind of make your way, that I think is really important as far as young people traveling. And I think it's easier said than done, right? Parents don't want terrible things to happen to their children. And I think one good control is finding good programs for the students to travel with that have good reputations, that have testimonials that speak to the kinds of experiences they create. Are they trying to place children with host families, or are they putting them in hotels where the children are spending more time with one another rather than with members of the community they're visiting? Are they being led by people with skill working with young people and also cross-cultural skills? Because you could be a really great teacher, but a really horrible traveler and unable to kind of navigate these complicated environments and not have language skills yourself, right? So I think the kinds of programs that we send our students on have really qualified trip leaders who have done it before, who've been all over the world, or who specialize in a particular part of the world and have lived there themselves and just know the lay of the land in ways that just that builds trust, right? And that allows you to kind of entrust them with your children. And so I think knowing the kind of program is, to me, more important than knowing about the place. Obviously that is important too, but I think especially when it comes to youth travel, the programs make all the difference in the world and are the kind of key to not just a safe experience, but a productive and meaningful and generative experience, because there are plenty of programs out there that are just trying to take money and aren't really thinking critically about how to bring young people into a community. Is it focused entirely on volunteerism, or is it focused on some kind of exchange, some recognition that the people in the host country have knowledge to share, not just needs to be met? And so I think those are the things that I tend to be critical of because of the nonprofit that I run, but also because of my own critique of volunteerism and student travel programming, because often it's just it's a means to make money off of people's desire to travel, but also to pad their resumes for college. And so I think it's important to be critical of those kinds of programs more than to be worried about the parts of the world they go to. Not that doesn't matter, but I think there are plenty of programs that can take people the far-flung corners of the world and places that we might not think of when it comes to youth travel, and give them incredible experiences that change the course of their lives.
What is the host family experience like? I've never, I've always heard about it, but I've never actually talked to somebody about what that is like. Do you I don't say become part of, but do they assume, is it like a wife swap kind of thing where you're expected to kind of blend into the family? Like, do you get chores as a young person in the house? Like, do you eat dinner with them? Do you have to live by a certain set of house rules? What's that experience like?
Yeah, I would say it varies depending on the place and the kind of program. So I've had two major host family experiences. One in high school when I went to Mexico, and I was there with two other students. So one other girl from my high school, and then one slightly older college student. And we all lived under the same roof. And I think we shared a bedroom, or me and my classmate shared one bedroom. Like, it was set up with twin beds, and then the college student, I think, had her own room. But that was interesting, and I end up talking about this in the book a bit, because that family, despite the fact that the husband and the children spoke English, they insisted that we speak Spanish. And if there was a word that we didn't know in Spanish, then we had to, what they call circumlocute, where you talk around the word and you say, the word I'm trying to think of is like, it's a, if you're describing like a cherry, you're like, it's a fruit, it's red, it's small, it has a seed inside. And then they're like, oh, cherry. And I just think that was so great, even though, he was there to help in a pinch if we really couldn't express ourselves. But I thought that was just such an incredible way to learn the language and to use the tools available to you to communicate. And there are all kinds of ways to communicate, even if you're not entirely fluent. And it took a lot of patience on their part to have these high school students who had, high school Spanish that we thought was good, but was not nearly, enough to have a conversation at the dinner table, right? But we eventually, even in that short time, got better at it. And as far as like how we were integrated into the family, not very much, because it was a short trip. We were spending a lot of our time at a language center, but we had meals with them. And that meant that we were integrated into the family table and like their experience of coming together over a meal. We had breakfast with them. And I think we had every meal with them, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In contrast, when I was in college, I did a semester in Argentina with a host mother. So it wasn't a family setup. And I had that set up. Other students in my program were in family setups, like big families where they had both parents, teenagers, college kids, and just a party all the time, a house full of people. Whereas in my case, it was just me and my host mother. She had kids, but they were growing up and out of the house. And so we were kind of companions, like we just got to hang out together. And I didn't have chores. I had to, keep my own room clean, but I wasn't responsible for like cleaning bathrooms or anything like that. And in fact, I always remember her cleaning the bathrooms, and she would play in a New York Minute every Saturday at full blast. I would wake up to the sound of that song without fail. It's like the thing when I hear that song, it transports me immediately back to studying abroad. And I think now, one of the things that I always like to encourage people to do if they want an immersive experience of travel is to stay with the host family. And there are programs out there that arrange that sort of thing so that instead of staying at an Airbnb or a hotel, you can stay in someone's home. And so I think that's a really cool way, even for a short visit, to immerse yourself in the culture of the place and to be uncomfortable, right? Because sometimes you are living under someone else's roof with someone else's rules and someone else's cooking and all that stuff that's out of your control. But travel in many ways is about surrendering control. And in exchange, you kind of get these experiences that even kind of allow for funny stories and funny memories and associations, but also just that experience of living the life of someone who is local to that place, because we don't always get that as visitors, try as we might, right? Like there's nothing like staying in a home with the people who are from that place and eating the meals they eat for breakfast and dinner and just going along with it and figuring your way out.
That would be a really
situations. Yeah.
Cool show where you do unconventional stays. Like, I never considered that you could stay with a host family without being there for an academic purpose. Just like in terms of leisure tourism, right? Like they did, like there's couch surfing, there's house sitting, there's hostels, hotels, all those little things in between. I'm really curious now as to what the other in-betweens are. Like, different way, the non-conventional, is it conventional or non-conventional? I think it's non-conventional, right? The non-conventional ways to actually stay abroad someplace. Are the host families like vetted? Do they have like a process or something that
that makes them eligible? I think it depends on the program, and I haven't looked into this in quite some time, but I do remember that there was a sort of vetting process in the way that there is, even if you want to host someone in the US, right? You have to do a background check and state your reasons so that it's clear you're not just in it for a check, because that can happen where people just want to get paid and then they don't actually provide you with good food and that kind of cultural experience. And so I think there's that. There's also the option, I've never done this, but I know that Airbnb, beyond the whole house or whole apartment rental, is having a room in someone's home. And increasingly, as places have rightly, brought the hammer down on Airbnb because of what it does to local rental markets, that I think is a way to truly belong everywhere, right? That's the Airbnb motto. But that's one way, I think, to experience the place from the perspective of a local, assuming that they do it right and it's not just a bunch of tourists in an apartment together, but instead some student or young professional or retired couple or what have you, right? But I think that those possibilities are maybe increasingly common or available because of the changes to Airbnb, because of local real estate markets and laws, right, that are changing. I think that could be a really interesting way forward.
That was actually my first Airbnb stay. I'd gone to Casablanca, and my host, I rented a room, and she had at least one other person staying there at the time, and she was a dream. She would have been perfect for this type of setup. She had, I won't say availability, but she gave me a tour. We spent the entire day walking around Casablanca. Like, she knew I was into tea, and I don't remember what one of the things, like, well, what do you like? And I think I told him a couple little things, and she had the entire day planned for me. She was incredible. I paid her for it, but that type of experience, I can absolutely see being in alignment with someone that would be like a host family. My concern would be like ending up with like a creeper or something like that. Like, I haven't really wanted to share space with anyone since. I think I'd only done it like maybe twice, 2 or 3. No, I had Norway was also another really, really, really incredible host. I've actually gotten really lucky and had some very incredible hosts for the few that I did interact with in terms of my Airbnb stays. I've really lucked out. But along the vein of what you were saying in terms of kind of touching on the sustainability aspect of travel, right? Where Airbnb is rightfully so cracking down on the what's the word or phrase I'm looking for, like the not the local people, the corporations, the people that are coming in and buying like 6 different houses in an area and Airbnb them all. They never set foot in the place themselves, right? How can we as travelers, whether we're traveling for, healthcare, visiting family, whatever, how do we consider communities as we're visiting them? How can we be more sustainable and being a better part of community while being in someone else's community?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a lot of that work starts before you even book your trip. My partner at the Wandering Scholar and I ran a series of workshops on what we call intentional travel, which is travel with a meaningful purpose that considers the environmental impact and the experience of local members of the community when we arrive at our destinations. And one of the things that started to occur to us as we were doing these workshops is that when it comes to sustainability, tourism is a real menace, especially in places like Venice, right, where there's such a thing as over tourism. And it's making it difficult, if not impossible, for local populations to survive and to thrive. And that's true in other parts of the world as well. The Caribbean is really vulnerable to tourism, especially because of the cruise industry that dumps a lot of waste in Caribbean waters that then has an impact on the lived experiences of the people who inhabit those places. And so it often means asking ourselves uncomfortable questions like, do I need to go to this place? Are there
Hawaii?
Right, exactly. And with a place like Hawaii, many local Hawaiians are asking tourists not to go, right? And so what does it mean to show respect for the members of that community if they're saying, please don't come here? It might mean not going, right? And then asking ourselves, well, what is it that makes me want to travel in the first place, but also to this place? Is it to have that box check to say, well, I went to Dubai, I went to Hawaii, I went to Venice? Or is it to experience something ecological, something cultural? Are there other places in the world that you can go to experience those things without causing a negative environmental impact, or visiting a place where the locals aren't actually benefiting? Just to your point about the corporations that have invaded the Airbnb market, there's a lot of multinational corporations that have taken over Caribbean communities and do not channel that money that they make from visitors into the local community. And so what do we know about the hotels that we're staying at? Is there a way to ensure that we're spending as much of our money in the community itself? And all of this is about making sure that as travelers, our progressive politics, if we have them, are aligned with our activities as travelers, that it's not a pause button on our politics. It's very much an extension of it. And I was reading, The Atlantic had a really funny and poignant article that was about the cruise industry. And it was written by a writer who is really sharp and funny, and had this experience. He went on this gigantic cruise ship to write about it and to kind of be critical of the cruise industry, and had this experience when he was in St. Thomas of being called a redneck. And he had this internal kind of crisis where he's like, but I care about the Caribbean. I know who Derek Walcott is. I read his work. I think critically. I'm not one of the people that he had been kind of writing about in the article who are uncritical. A lot of them were MAGAs and people who seemed very indifferent to the places that they were traveling to and the people. And what they liked about a lot of the places they stopped was that they were kind of Disney-fied versions of Caribbean islands that only belonged to the cruise companies. And he had this
hamburgers and fish sticks everywhere.
Right, exactly. On island, on the boat, everywhere they went. And he had this moment where he realized that as far as this guy in St. Thomas was concerned, they were all the same.
Yeah.
And he really struggled with that idea, but it's not that surprising because he was on the ship too, right? And he was debarking with everybody else, and he might have thought of himself as a very particular, sophisticated sort of person, but he was engaging in an activity that is read a certain way. And at that point, it does flatten you into a type, and you are complicit in the thing that you purport to take issue with. And so what I really found poignant about that article was that there's a question at the heart of it. It's not a question that he's asking, but it's one that he's unintentionally raising, which is, if we don't want to be seen that way, then what do we do differently? And does it mean that we can't always do the things that we want to do? It might.
Yeah. It's a really fair question. It is a fair question. It's kind of like, especially to your point back with the hotels that you're staying in. Like, I am personally like an Airbnb girl, but for, say, like a shorter stay, if I'm only going to be someplace for a day, I'm cool with a hotel. But like when you choose an Airbnb, sometimes it can feel easy to look at who's even renting the home. Read the description, the little bio of the person. Do they live there? Have they been there for 25, 35 years? Do they, is this, we're renting our parents' house and we live nearby, whatever. Like, you can look into some of this information. I mean, I don't expect people to do, a deep dive into different hotels. I mean, if that's your jam, by all means, please go right ahead. But I get that also for many people, it's just like cost is a factor, right? Like, I can only afford an X, Y, and Z package, and these are my options within said budget. But those are questions that if it is something that you say matters to you, I really like what you said about pausing on your politics. Like, you have to make that decision about what is going to be important to you. And one of the things that's important to me when I travel is actively being able to experience Black history, wherever it is and whatever that may look like in a specific location. And one of the things that I have found particularly frustrating is how difficult it can be to find that information about different places. I feel like there are so many opportunities for, this is the world's biggest bowl of yarn, or this is the this, and this is the blah, blah, blah of wherever you are. But in that specific lane of information, the onus is on the person to do that research and to dive into who of note is from here, or where is there a historical trail or tour that can be taken in an area. How do you suggest for those of us that may be traveling either for leisure or for any other myriad of reasons? I don't want to say like more easily, but specific resources, right? Because my favorite is to always just go to Airbnb and their experiences tab or Viator. I've been calling them Viator for years, but apparently it's Viator. But, the different little apps that you can purchase packages for. If you're not going to purchase a package, how would you suggest, obviously the Googles, but are there certain subsects of the internet? Because there's a right way and a wrong way to Google. You can type something into the search engine and not get, the best answer. But I don't expect you to necessarily do a scholarly search also for a tour. Yeah. So how would you suggest that we find this information when it seems that it can be really hidden from us?
Yeah. And I think that you're right that it can seem hidden because I think a lot of these things don't yet exist. These experiences of Black history in the various parts of the world where there is a strong and growing and enduring Black presence. But one thing that I think has been pleasantly surprising is how many Black X city tours there are. So that's, I think, a Google search that is worth doing wherever you're going. Black Paris tours, Black Lisbon tours. And I know for a fact that those things exist. When I was writing Beyond the Shores, I took 2 tours that were focused on the history of Black people in Paris. One is called Black Paris Tours and the other is called Walking the Spirit, but you would be able to find them both with that kind of search. And they, I was really impressed by just how expansive their approach is to Black history. So it's not just about African Americans going to Paris in the 1920s. It's also about the most recent arrival of African populations, the long history of African populations in Paris, that allows you to kind of see these individuals and their experiences in a fuller context and think about the relationships between these groups and what has made relationship and allyship difficult, if at times impossible. And so I think both of those tours do really interesting things. I've never taken a Black Lisbon tour. I don't think it existed when I went to Lisbon several years ago, but I think that's one of another example of these tours that are cropping up. It's led by, at least the last time I looked it up, it was led by a young African man living in Lisbon, who talks about the Portuguese kind of colonial heritage that has resulted in a Black presence in Portugal and Lisbon in particular. And there are a lot of those cropping up. There are Black Amsterdam tours, Black Berlin tours, and I think they've modeled what's possible, even with scant bits of information, to say, you know, we can go to this place and tell a story about a Black person that was here, and we can go to this other part of the city and tell a story about either that same person, just following some of the routes that they traveled, the places they stayed and ate and visited. Or I think people could do some of that themselves too, is to cobble together some sense of kind of a way of retracing the steps of people that they're interested in, right? But it shouldn't be so hard. There should be more of them. I think the Airbnb experience idea that you mentioned is a really great one, because I know, for example, that there are young Black men in South Africa doing township tours and taking control of that model of tourism from companies, from outsiders who have historically, in South Africa and in Brazil with their favela tours, historically just kind of created this sort of Gawker experience where you go and you kind of watch the people in this community like they're zoo animals. Meanwhile, expect them to perform for you while they're not reaping any benefits from it, because it's the tour company and these outsiders who are governing it all. But increasingly, people are able, in really scrappy ways, to take control over that process and make themselves available on Airbnb or Viator to reframe the narrative and to take control over the stories that are being told about the places that they live, and also benefit financially from the tourist presence in the places where they live. And Brazil, for example, in Rio, the name is escaping me, but it's I just talked about this in a class that I taught. I can always dig it up and send it to you, but there are increasing numbers of Black heritage tours cropping up in Brazil, not just focused on favelas, but focused on the whole of Rio de Janeiro, for example, or the whole of Sao Paulo, to say that like these places were built by enslaved people and they ran on the labor of enslaved people. And even if there's no signage that points to their history and to their presence, we can still tell you stories based on those places, based on the waterfront, based on these buildings that housed wealthy families that were attended to by enslaved people. Like, we can still tell that story, and it's not a story that fits only in one pocket of the city, but it's one that takes over the whole city. And I think these are models of what can happen in so many parts of the world.
I think one of the things that you had mentioned about the different types of people that were giving the stories, and I was thinking about the different tour guides that I've had in different countries that have given different Black history tours. One of the places that I was so taken aback at discovering Black history, and it happened completely by accident, was in Costa Rica. I don't know why it had never crossed my mind. I'd never seen a Black Costa Rican knowingly. Positive I've seen one. I live in New York, but I didn't know, right? I was in the museum, as I do, just wandering around looking at stuff. And there was like an entire wing for Black history. And it was like, duh, everywhere, right? And then in Colombia, I want to say, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Rocha. Alex Rocha and his son Chris do, I cannot remember what the name of the tour company is, but I took the Palenque tour. They do a bunch of tours in the Cartagena area, And one of them was going to Palenque, and to your point, where you are in the community, in the smaller villages of these locals. And what is nice about it is that they are engaging with us. We are engaging with them. And it's not like a performative thing. We're watching them do things. And they had a t-shirt that basically said, "Let a Black man tell you Black history." And it had me thinking of other tour guides who were not Black and did their best. God bless them. They were really nice people, but it always feels better getting your history from your people. And as a finishing aside to that, though, consider that not everyone necessarily, like it's one thing to know, right, that Blackness is a monolith, that we don't look like one thing, we don't sound like one thing, behave like one thing, or the anything. That is not a monolith, excuse me. But I will never forget the guide that I had, one of the guides that I had in Guadeloupe. And I think we spent 80% of the day together. And I was thinking this was a white woman. And lo and behold, I don't know how the conversation came up. I think we were talking about families and surnames. And she was saying that when people hear her name and when she announces, like when she says the family she's from, they just, and she's like, "Yeah, my dad's Black." And she showed me a picture of her parents, and her daddy's my color. And this is I would have assumed, a fully white woman. And so it's just like the nuance to Blackness that you know and understand. It's like, don't bring that with you. It extends beyond your circle, and like give space for that to exist and lean into it and see all what you can actively get from it. And that happens by being part of community in the places that we visit. And Dr. Walker, I thank you for being in community with me here on Travel and Shit. How can we support you? Where can we find your work? Where can we support what you're doing and learn more from you?
Well, thanks for having me. And one place I'd love for people to stop by is the website for my nonprofit, The Wandering Scholar. It's thewanderingscholar.org. And there are different ways to support the work that we do. Again, we send low-income high school students, rising high school juniors and seniors on immersive study abroad experiences over the summer. And every donation that we receive goes directly to our programming and to sending these students on these trips. The other way people can support the work that we do is by applying to be travel mentors for our students. We tend to pair our students with mentors who come from similar backgrounds or who have spent time in similar places to where we're sending our students, and who can model for our students a kind of engaged, globally minded citizenship. That's what we try to cultivate in our students. That's what we try to embody for them. And often our students have these amazing experiences and aren't really sure what comes next. And so our travel mentors are people who have either majored in foreign languages in college or studied abroad in college and can help make the connection for these students of what they can do with those experiences. Or they're people who in their lives, such as yourself, embody this global citizenship and this global engagement and thinking about the world in really critical ways, and being out in the world in ways that shape that critical lens. And so we always welcome people to support our organization, both financially, but also with their time and with their wisdom and expertise. And lately, we've also been producing a Substack that really embodies our vision of engaged, globally competent citizenship through it's an online travel magazine. Each issue will say something about what we're doing at the Wandering Scholar, but it's also a way of just thinking about what's out there in the world and how to think about things that come our way in the world of hot topics in the travel sphere. The very kinds of things I've been talking about today in terms of intentional travel and the kinds of questions that we should be asking ourselves, and the kinds of experiences we can create for ourselves when we're out in the world. And so that Substack is called Postcards at Substack.com, or postcards.substack.com, if people want to subscribe and support that kind of content production.
The links will obviously be in the description box, y'all. And as I tell y'all every week, travel is so much more than vacation. And this week, it was absolutely historical and it was informative. Dr. Walker, again, I thank you so much for your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you guys have enjoyed it as well. And I will see you guys next week. Bye.